Things are going to start happening to me now.
You've done all the reading. You're a scholar. You're a professor. You've done all the reading. You've done the intellectual heavy lifting.
More or less, eat shit and die.
You wouldn't know a fact if it begged you all night long.
Want to give the wrong impression, because I am very high.
Ran up behind him with a hatchet. Smash, smash, smash.
Yeah. Care. I'm a libertarian. What I'm getting is,
Did you vote for Joe Jorgensen or Trump?
Who?
Joe Jorgensen. That was the perfect answer. Thank you. That was...
Oh boy. Welcome everybody to the Libertarian Podcast Review. This is Tyler Yonke. We're still doing Tom Woods Week. Tom Woods Month. Tom Woods Extended Week. I don't know what to really tell you. It's taken forever. This is episode 3.5. It was supposed to be the third day of clips featuring Tom Woods, and clips numbers. What do we got here? 921 through 13.8. No, or was it 2.5? Maybe it's 2.2. 2. I'm so confused as to where we're even at here. 2. It was supposed to be day 2. Episodes 461 through 920. We're halfway through those, and then we're going to the next one we're going to see is going to be clips with respect. It's supposed to be episode 3, but we're probably 4 or 5. I don't know. 921 through 1380. Hang on, people. We've got a great slew of clips for you here today. Once again, we're walking through the Tom Woods Week. We're doing 0 through 2300 plus because he won't stop. Tom, you need to stop. Give us a chance to catch up. But he's not going to because he is Tom Woods. Thanks, everybody. Check these ones out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, make a comment in here. Tell me that you hate me, that you like me, that you love Tom Woods. We love Tom Woods, and this is our tribute to him on Tom Woods Week. Thank you very much. This is the Tom Woods show we're talking about here. But let's go to this one. This is Presidents Who Screwed Up, Brion McClanahan. Big fan of him. I'm from the North. I grew up in the Northwest. I live in Northern California, but I have a lot of sympathy for the South in a sense. I understand all this. I've read a lot of books about this. The South had the better army. They just were overrun with money and, whatever. That's not really the point I'm making. I don't know why I'm saying this. I'm drinking a little bit. Brion McClanahan talks about, he has a book about presidents who screwed up America. Let's go to episode 591, a setup for why Brion McClanahan even wrote this.
Title and subtitle. And, okay, what made you decide the presidents have to be talked about? Have we talked about the presidents enough?
Well, no. I think that we haven't talked about them enough, at least in the way I talk about them in the book. And the idea that I followed, it actually was born out of my 2012, The Founding Fathers Guide to the Constitution. When I was doing the interviews for that, I made a statement that every president in the last 100 years, virtually every president, should have been impeached. Amen. And people were shocked by that. In fact, I was on with G. Gordon Liddy, and he got a good laugh out of that. And he said, well, I agree. But that was one thing that people were trying to key in on. And I said, well, I need to write something that would explain why I would say that. And the yardstick I used by which to measure the presidents is how they defended their oath, which is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And this has really never been done before in this kind of way. It's been piecemealed. But so what I wanted to do was look at all the presidents and say, okay, we've got Barack Obama, who's awful. We all agree with that. But how did he get here? And where did all that come from? And so I trace executive abuse essentially from the first administration to the Obama administration. And I pick that the title says 9, but there's actually 13 presidents in there who did a very bad job, at least according to their oath. And then I put 4 in who I thought did a really good job according to their oath. And some of these people in the 4 are not really household names. Now, your listeners are going to recognize, Grover Cleveland and Calvin Coolidge. But the person I said is the greatest president in American history is John Tyler. So maybe not a household name. And then on the other side, again, your listeners are very savvy, so they're going to get them. But, Abraham Lincoln's in that group, and Wilson, and Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, Truman, Johnson, Nixon, of course, the last 4. But then also Andrew Jackson and George Washington, who does not escape a little critique as well. So I wanted to have this comprehensive look at the executive branch and where it's gone off the rails and maybe what we could do about it. I'll offer a chapter on that as well. So it was a lot of fun to write, and I think it's going to be maybe surprising to the mainstream reader, and also maybe a few surprises in there for your readers and listeners as well.
I'm a big fan of Brion McClanahan. I listen to his podcast. He's got a great voice for podcasting. Okay, next one, GW, George Washington.
The one that people just, it's like they're avoiding it like the plague, is George Washington. Now.
Let's talk about George Washington then.
So George Washington. Now, I admire George Washington. He is the indispensable man. He's the greatest American in American history, in my estimation. I've written about him in other books. I think he's a real American hero. He is one of the greatest of the founding generation, if not the greatest. But as president, he did a couple of things that were wrong. And I think, again, I did this, and I'm going to take the sacred cows to task when we need to do it. And Washington was one of those guys. So the two things that Washington did, now you can blame Hamilton for this too, because Hamilton was in Washington's ear all the time. But the two things he did was his response to the Whiskey Rebellion and the Neutrality Proclamation. So the response to the Whiskey Rebellion, you had, of course, famously, you had this tax revolt on the frontier, and these Pennsylvania farmers weren't going to pay the taxes. Which what most people don't realize is that tax that they were rebelling against had already been repealed, so there was going to be no tax anyways. But they're in rebellion against this tax. They're going after tax collectors, et cetera, et cetera. And so Hamilton insists that the army be marched into Pennsylvania to put down this revolt, this tax revolt. And what's really funny about that is when they show up, of course, there's nobody there. But the real part that's the constitutional controversy is that they had no permission from the state of Pennsylvania to do this. The governor of the state, Thomas Mifflin, who was actually part of the entire ratification and drafting process of the Constitution, did not give them permission to enter the state. The legislature did not give them permission to enter the state. And as per the Constitution, you need permission from a state to march the army into the state to put down a quote-unquote rebellion. And that's the justification they were using. So Washington was violating the Constitution at Hamilton's request in doing this.
By the way, Brion's if you want to talk about Southern stuff, he is your go-to guy. He is great. He has a lot of knowledge. There's several people like this that Phil Magnus has been on here that Tom has talked to about like the 1619 project as an example. Phil Magnus has not how do I say this? He's blocked me on Twitter, basically. Andy and I did a podcast actually with Stefan Kinsella where we talked about him taking on Hoppe and I love Magnus, but he goes, Phil Magnus, but he went on with Reason and Nick and they talked about this and his critique is so bad. It makes, then this is what I said. I'm like, you listen to this and it's so bad. It's a bad faith argument that he makes that makes you wonder about all the other stuff he said. He's great. I'm like, I take it into his 1619 and I'm like, I believe it and I'm good. And then I hear this and I go, what the hell? Now I'm wondering about all the stuff you've said before. I'm questioning. It's ridiculous. And he blocked me on Twitter, probably rightly so. But I also didn't like the fact that he wore a golf shirt for the interview. So there's that as well. Okay, let's continue on with this. What do we have? This one is John Tyler.
Just because I know you. I've known you for a long time. And I know that of those four, you would most like to talk about John Tyler. Am I wrong?
That's correct. Yeah.
All right. So let me give you you have to get a 19th century figure in here. So let's talk about John Tyler. What makes him so great?
Well, John Tyler, I call the greatest president in American history.
By the way, he has got a great podcast voice. I hate Brion McClanahan for that.
Reason that here's a guy that assumed office, right? The first president to assume office after William Henry Harrison kicks the bucket. And he comes in and you have the Whigs just exuberant about the fact they've taken Congress, they've got the executive branch, they're really going to get their agenda through. But they didn't think about John Tyler and who he actually was. This is a guy that cut his teeth at the table with Thomas Jefferson. And so he's a Jeffersonian. His father was very good friends with Thomas Jefferson. And he was the guy that gave the one speech against the force bill when Andrew Jackson was trying to get that ran through Congress. So he was a states' rights Democrat. And but he becomes a Whig because of the nullification controversy in South Carolina. He can't support the Democrats anymore. So he comes into office, and the Whigs have a meeting with him, the cabinet, and they say, "Look, Tyler, here's what's going to happen. You're going to rubber stamp all our legislation because we're going to run the show, and you're just going to do what we say." And Tyler says, "No, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm the president. If you don't like it, you can resign." So they start passing all this legislation through the Congress. They're going to recharter, or they're going to get a new charter for a third bank of the United States. They're going to get federally funded internal improvements. They're going to start pushing for higher tariffs. And Tyler vetoes everything. In fact, Henry Clay, who was behind all this legislation, gets so angry. He goes to the White House, which they call the executive mansion, goes to the White House, And he gets in a heated argument with Tyler, and Tyler basically just lets him have it. He says, look, I'm here. I'm in the executive branch. I'm going to do what I have to do, my job. You go back to the Capitol, and you do what you have to do. But understand that essentially I'm going to veto everything that's unconstitutional. And they never spoke again. And in Tyler's veto messages, he actually wrote in one of the veto messages on the recharting of the bank, the second bill that came before him, that he has a duty to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And because of that, he has to veto unconstitutional legislation.
Imagine that. A president doing that kind of stuff. We've seen with too many of them that they don't adhere to that. Biden's been slapped down many times with the Supreme Court as things that he's done is unconstitutional, and he just goes ahead and does them. He doesn't give a shit. So last one we'll do here. What if Heritage Foundation wrote this book? And by the way, Peter St. Onge was just on the Human Action podcast with Bob Murphy. Jeff Deist wasn't on there. I don't know what the status of that podcast is going to be going forward. However, I think he works at the Heritage Foundation, so you can't just necessarily eliminate the Heritage Foundation as shit. But what if they wrote this book? Here you go. This is about the presidents. So the best presidents or worst presidents in the United States.
I don't hate to pick on the Heritage Foundation. Suppose the Heritage Foundation put together a book on the presidency. What would I read there? How would it be different from yours, and how would it be different from Doris Kearns Goodwin?
Well, I think it would be almost similar to Doris Kearns Goodwin. The only difference you would have is that maybe you would get someone like Ronald Reagan in the good ones, but you would definitely see Lincoln. You'd probably even see FDR because of his activities during World War II. I mean, he is revered by conservatives, many conservatives, because he won World War II, theoretically. So you would see Teddy Roosevelt in that list on a Heritage Foundation list. So you would see the people that that Goodwin would pick. I think the only difference is maybe the Heritage Foundation would not include Johnson. Goodwin might include Johnson. Maybe they wouldn't include Truman. Goodwin might include that. But what I've done is essentially flip the entire ranking system on its head. And you mentioned the classes coming up. When you get that one.
Okay, Doris Kearns Goodwin would also just plagiarize because that's what she does. So Brion McClanahan, solid guy. Let's keep going on here. 683, rapper turns Rothbardian. You probably know who this is. Robbie Bernstein? No, it's Eric July. Take it away.
What were you exposed to that made you say, yep, this is the way to go?
Well, I grew up a hardcore leftist. Growing up, same old story with a lot of African Americans kind of beating our head. Republicans are racist. Democrats want to help you, even though they want to expand the state. And it wasn't until I got to college when I even knew what libertarianism was. And I got here by guys like Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams. And it's funny because those guys aren't necessarily ANCAP. Walter Williams is a libertarian, but he's not, necessarily an ANCAP. But those guys are reading things like books like Basic Economics and seeing what these guys have been saying for 30 years. And really, again, going back to the point, just extending it to its logical conclusion was how I got to where I'm at. So it was before I picked up any kind of, Rothbard book or anything like that, when I had actually considered myself an actual ANCAP.
Solid stuff. Eric July, who's featured on The Blaze a lot. This one is, I thought this was a kind of an interesting little concept, which is Tom Wood talking about like, hey, look, I have black guests on. Rare in the libertarian / conservative movement. Some pushback on that, and this was his take.
Let me tell you something about a couple of guests I've had on, or in particular recently, as it turns out, it was episode 666. I had a guy named TK Coleman on. We had a great conversation about entrepreneurship and, making your own way and so on. And now he's a black guy, and I didn't mention that on the show. I didn't, because I thought I bet you every time this guy comes on a show, the whole show is, oh, you're a black libertarian. And I thought, I have a funny feeling he has other things to talk about. So I didn't even mention, people didn't even know his race. But yet, and I said that to Walter Williams too. I said, here you are, this PhD economist, you're a genius, you know all these different fields and all the ins and outs and all the math, and yet every time you're on the radio, all they want to do is talk about race. Doesn't that bother you? But in your case, you're just going to have to forgive me, because I think it is really integral to your story.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So tell me how it is that you would reach out to people saying, I know it's conventional to say the Democratic Party, they're going to help us out. How do you get people to think maybe that's not worked out so well?
Well, what I've done is, and I found this definitely attacking, just not necessarily attacking, this is the wrong word to use, but approaching the talking points of leftists in general. It's more so kind of turning their own logic against them and turning those talking points, and again, just really extending them all the way to the actual conclusion. Yes, leftists and Democrats in particular, they have kind of this political monopoly on predominantly black communities. And you look at even some of the gripes of activist groups that I almost disagree with nearly 100%, but even on some issues, when they get it right, the conclusion is where they get it completely wrong. So I like to, those talking points like Black Lives Matter. They talk about the, systematic racism and, racism within the judicial system and all of that. And, I like to kind of, and I did an article on being libertarian about this and saying how if African Americans, Black folks just understood the history, they would adopt libertarianism almost immediately.
Interesting. Okay. More Eric July. I mean, Eric's fascinating. I love when he comes on these different shows. We did have Walter Williams came on as a guest. This one is his Music Online. By the way, I love one of their covers of Linkin Park. Anyway, go ahead.
I mean, are you finding that on balance, the internet is a real help for you?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, depends on which way you want to approach it, because internet has absolutely kind of changed I would say the economics. I did a video about this, the economics of actually being in a band, and which is why we do this. Kind of on a side note, I don't want to go too much in to it unless it's an actual question about it. But the economics of being in a band has kind of changed with the internet age. But as far as getting that information out there, it is a very useful tool for guys like us who are very skeptical. We've been down that road of dealing with labels and stuff like that. So it's so much that you can do in spreading it. But it's a kind of a catch, because then you have to kind of figure out how do you make this actually lucrative if it's something that you want to be able to do full time, which with us, it's a little different because we have so much to offer aside from just the music itself. And, we talk about the message and stuff like that. We're always doing talks and stuff in which we can get our message out there. And it's also kind of monetize it. But I can understand why a lot of bands, definitely in the subgenres that we kind of middle in, they're not really able to do that. So
okay, once again, it's Linkin Park, Waiting for the End, covered by Backwards. That's his metal group, Eric July's, which I think is fantastic. While I get the next clip up, we'll just play a little bit of this because it's, by the way, it's one of my favorites.
This is not what I had planned. It's out of my control. Flying at the speed of light.
Fantastic.
Thoughts were spinning in my head. So many things were left unsaid.
Backwards. A little bit different than a lot of the stuff they do, but this is a great song by Linkin Park. Okay, we'll move on, even though they don't know what it takes to move. Okay, let's go to the Adam Smith one here. Sorry, guys, you're going to have to be quiet here. I'm going to move you to the end, and then we'll talk about this. Gene Epstein came on the show. Gene Epstein, and I'm trying to hit all the big hitters here, but he comes on the show, episode 704, Adam Smith, not the founder of economic science. Tom just had a recent episode, and I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name, but he came back and he tried to contradict a little bit, push back against Gene Epstein. But Gene Epstein, what's the Soho Forum there, big guy?
Please, everybody, write this down and go into the website, because you can register right now and get an invitation. It's called thesohoforum.org. I think everybody can spell Soho, the Soho Forum, continuous.org. And some of the young people on my staff advised me to give it that sort of locational name, because it is going to be in a huge art gallery in Soho, capacity 150 seats, which would have meant, of course, that people would have been out on the street when Tom debated Michael Malice, but mostly, and then there's a downstairs as well. The SohoForum.org has.
By the way, we'll just give a little bit of that. The Soho Forum, I've really enjoyed a lot of their stuff. They put it up on Reason, ended up posting it on their website or their YouTube, Reason.tv. And one of the Scott Horton, the Bill Kristol was fantastic. It was quite an annihilation of neocon. Everybody wanted to see. What we're looking for is someone to debate Ben Shapiro, have him show up talking about Israel, Palestine. That would be a great discussion. But what's this one? Why bash Adam Smith? Let's get to the real issue of this topic of episode 704.
So why do you bring this up now? Why does this matter?
Well, as a matter of fact, it's always been an issue for me, and I have a way to end the madness, to come to a truce on this subject. I, too, well, by the way, it's that 2-volume work of Rothbard's is one of my favorite books of his, and I love most of his books. It's sort of almost like a bathtub reading, because it's such an entertaining tour through the personalities and all the issues, going back to Plato and Aristotle. It's a fantastic book. And his attack on Adam Smith is mostly true as far as it goes. But I think that it's a bit imbalanced. But on the other side, my own story is, for example, when I was watching a great series called Econ Pop, put on by John Popola, who's, I don't know if he's been on your show, I got into an argument with a lot of people who also have been on your show. That includes Don Boudreau, it includes Mark Skousen, and it includes Johan Norberg. Those people are, all I said is, please, let's stop calling Adam Smith the father of economics. He wrote a great book. I believe he wrote a great book, but it's a deeply flawed book. It's got so much in it that socialists can use against us, that if you keep putting it out there as what amounts to the Bible of economics and of free market economics, then you are going to be vulnerable to those who would point out that there's so much in that book that gives aid and comfort to socialists.
Okay, I think that's something I hadn't heard, and I'm like, okay, I get it. And he does drop some sweet nuggets on that. Prices, division of labor, and long-winded Gene Epstein. Tough to get clips.
Explanation of what's happening.
Yes, no, I agree with that. I see in this discussion, Tom, I think it's sort of two tracks. Where I have a huge correspondence with a lot of people I really like and really respect out there who are just absolutely drunk on Adam Smith, in my view, and that's Don Boudreau, Mark Skousen, Russ Roberts. They think that this is the book, and you're right in making that point, that the point that you just made. But I want to go for the easier points. I want to show that in particular, Peter Schiff had an argument in the mud at Occupy Wall Street that you can see on video, where some kid is quoting Adam Smith back to him. And how about just pointing out, related to what you just said, that Adam Smith made a distinction between value in use and value in exchange. He talked about the Marxist idea of essentially production for use versus production for exchange or production for profit. He couldn't figure out the water diamond paradox, at least not in that book. Ironically, Rothbard points out that he had resolved it in his lectures, but it doesn't mysteriously occur in his book. And so he writes very, very clearly that value has two meanings, and that water is so much more valuable than diamond.
I'm not going to keep going on with that. We're going to play extra clips. What the seminal part to take away from that is that Adam Schiff, once again, I mentioned that on episode 1, that I had seen Adam Schiff down there on Occupy Wall Street, and the people are using Adam Smith against him. Gene has a great point. You don't want to be using your own economics against you. Never do the bidding of the regime, in a sense. Okay, this is, let's see, 25 minutes in here. Labor theory of value, shortage of credit, and more are discussed. Entrepreneurship, 25:45. Let's go.
Guy been on your show is my friend Michael Strong. Michael's writing a book about entrepreneurship, and he neglects to state. I told him that, and the book is called Blind Spot, and I think it's a good book in process. But he neglects to point out that the blind spot of so many modern economists about entrepreneurship is echoed. Of course, it was repeated most egregiously by the blind spot in Smith about entrepreneurship when he had full access to Cantillon. I mean, that's the other point. So therefore, I think that related to Smith's problems and blind spots is that he could read Cantillon. He could read what essentially is 2 chapters on the role of the entrepreneur. Cantillon specifically stating that the entrepreneur buys at fixed prices and then he faces uncertainty. Then again, actually, in a way, I think the best chapter on entrepreneurship in Cantillon is when he's talking about these high rates of interest that entrepreneurs borrow at and the way they turn a profit on these high rates of interest, which allows them. But again, it's not even like for the future. It's that they're actually supplying needs in the relatively short run.
Okay, Gene goes on. Great stuff. Last one we'll do here is there anything good to take away about Adam Smith? Quality question, Tom Woods. Thanks for asking it.
Still some wonderful things in Adam Smith's book. I want to reach my hand across the table with those people who seem to have this great love of that book. There are passages in that book that I also love. Rothbard does talk about the undoubted importance of Adam Smith's famous passages on the invisible hand. But I also think, however, that Adam Smith wrote some wonderful things in favor of free trade, that he wrote about, and indeed, he did connect, I think, free trade with the division of labor. He talks about, let me quote a couple of sentences, and maybe we can end on that. I have in front of me, the tailor does not attempt to make his own shoes, but buys them of a shoemaker. The shoemaker does not attempt to make his own clothes, but employs a tailor. The farmer attempts to make neither the one nor the other, but employs those different artificers. All of them find it for their interest to employ their whole industry in a way in which they have some advantage over their neighbors. What is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. So the word kingdom, we might bridle that, but again, I think that's a very eloquent defense of free trade. And one other passage, which sounds...
You're going to have to wait and listen to it all yourself to know what that other passage is. That's as far as we go at this point. Okay. Next one, we're cruising along here. We're trying to get it all in. But this is the Tom Woods week. Okay. So what we have here is Tom Woods episode 796. Secession is for morons, says Ben Stein of Ferris Bueller's Day Off fame. Bueller, you know, that kind of guy. Then Win Ben Stein's Money. He also was on there with, that was Jimmy Kimmel that he had that on there, that show. By the way, you may not know this. What I know about Ben Stein is his dad was a very famous economist, okay? Wrote a book that's still, I think, used in whatever. Ben Stein was also an economist, and he was in the Nixon White House. I watched a documentary several years ago, and they're talking to him, and he's crying about the day that they found out that Nixon was resigning and whatnot. He was in the White House as an economist, and then he ends up going into Hollywood, and he's on Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So that's the guy we're talking about. Anyway, he writes an article. This is back years ago, 2016, I want to say, about secession. This is, by the way, we'll go back here. California is after the 2016 election. Trump is elected. Big thing, Calexit, about California seceding from the nation. Everyone's like, oh, now the lefties are doing it. And I'm like, yeah, let's do it. Okay. I'm up in there in the state of Jefferson. We've been trying to do this for years. And Ben Stein writes an article about it, and Tom talks about it.
This article that I want to talk to you about is by Ben Stein, who is the well-known actor. And before that, he was a speechwriter for Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford.
There you go.
He has an article called Secession is for Morons. And I thought, oh, man, come on now. What is that?
And by the way, this caught my interest only because MTG wrote something about it, and it's been all over the news lately. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I think is a complete moron, but they're never.
It's all about. And he is saying that he's outraged that there are people. It's not even that he's outraged. He is contemptuous. Let's say it that way. He's contemptuous of people in California who are saying that the election of Donald Trump really should spur us to think about secession. And obviously, California is a wealthy state, and it would be one of the biggest economies in the world, even as an independent state. So,
much like Texas,
this is stupid, according to Ben Stein. Why is it stupid? Well, he says they don't know history. Oh, boy. So now we're going to get a history lesson from Ben Stein. And he says the ultimate in idiocy is this idea that California should and could secede from the rest of the Union and become a separate country. And he says it's almost unbelievable, and yet it's also fascinating in a macabre way. He says the idea that a state could secede was what led South Carolina to proclaim secession as soon as Lincoln was elected in 1860. In short order, South Carolina was joined in this strange idea by, and then he goes on and lists some of the southern states. And then he says, if it had not been for Lincoln's arresting state officials, Kentucky and Maryland would have seceded too, and that would have been the end of the USA as we know it. All right, let's stop right there. In short order, South Carolina was joined in this strange idea. Strange idea. What strange idea is that? The idea of self-determination. The idea that a people should not be kept in a political association that it does not want, if I may quote Ludwig von Mises. That is the strange idea.
Okay, let's keep going on here. This next one, Tom Woods then kind of breaks down as a historian his understanding and what Madison basically said about SCOTUS can't be superior and gives the state power. The federal, much like Frankenstein's monster, can't be superior to Dr. Frankenstein. The creator is in charge of the created thing. And just keep in mind, what if the monster just gets out of control?
Now, here's an interesting concession by Ben Stein, however. Interesting concession. He says, the amazing thing is that there is nothing in the Constitution forbidding secession. Ah, well, that's okay. At least he admits that, which, by the way, automatically proves it's constitutional. So he doesn't try to say it's unconstitutional. He doesn't.
Well, he says
not only that, he says there's never been a Supreme Court case saying secession is illegal. Look for it. Go ahead. You won't find it. Well, there he's wrong. Texas versus White, 1869. So he's wrong about that. But to heck with that. The states created the federal government, and by extension, the federal courts. They can't have their own creation tell them what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. So you can ignore that. In fact, let me cite here a post of my own. I'm typing this in. I could just edit this out of the episode, but doggone it, I am not going to. I'm going to go to my site for a post from early 2011. James Madison, states need recourse against courts. This is, now, I'm not saying Madison was a big secession supporter, but, you know, the implications of what somebody says are important. Let me read you this little passage from Madison from his famous report of 1800. And you'll see what I mean about how the states are ultimately the players here, not the courts. And he's saying the resolution of the General Assembly, he's talking about the Virginia resolutions of 1798, which spoke about the power of Virginia to interpose between the federal government and the people of Virginia when the federal government exceeds its authority. It says the resolution of the General Assembly relates to those great and extraordinary cases in which all the forms of the Constitution may prove ineffectual.
I'm not going to let him read the whole thing. I just thought it was interesting there. Once again, he then ends it with, it's much like Frankenstein's monster can't be superior to Dr. Frankenstein because it's the thing that he's created. We talked about that, I think it was episode 82 with Walter E. Williams saying the principal and the agent. The principal, the states, create the agent, which is the federal government. The principals are always in charge. Now, the problem you have is when the agent or the monster becomes too much, which we're basically living in at this point. So, whoops. But the states have allowed that. The principal has allowed that. The SCOTUS has all allowed that. There you go. The will of the people. Let's keep going.
Court case. Then he says, but the will of the people is that we stay together as a union. And it was that will, greatly compounded by the wish of many to end slavery, that led to the bloodiest war in U.S. history. More than 600,000 men died to keep the Union together and to free the slaves. We'll get to the slaves in a minute, but how about that? The will of the people cannot be questioned. The will of the people, that's what we say to 600,000 deaths. Well, it was the will of the people. Maybe the will of the people is perverse. Plus, how do you know that's the will of the people? People weren't allowed to speak their minds during the war. People were thrown in jail for speaking against the war. Tom DiLorenzo will tell you all about that in his book, The Real Lincoln, but any reputable historian will tell you all about that. So how do we know what the will of the people was? There were a lot of northern newspaper editorials at the time that said, let the South go. It would contradict every single thing we stand for to engage in a violent suppression of their withdrawal from the Union. Now, I've done an episode, I guess I'll have to link to it. I've done at least one episode, probably more, on secession, but where I go through point by point the arguments in favor, and the arguments are just overwhelming.
Yes, you have done that, Tom. Okay, let's keep going on here. This next one we have is, once again, still secession for morons. This one is morons in Southern California.
Ben Stein, here we are. Okay. Then he says, do the morons who are proposing secession here in sunny Cal have any idea of just how serious a matter this is? Obviously, there is no issue on the table remotely as morally compelling as ending slavery. What is even remotely worth even the possibility of fighting another civil war? All right, this is so confused. This is so confused, I really don't know where to start. So he begins by saying, there's no issue on the table remotely as morally compelling as ending slavery. Okay, but since ending slavery had nothing to do with Lincoln's decision to launch the war, that, I mean, any historian will tell you that. Any historian. He was very, very blunt about that. He wanted to preserve the Union. So what he should say is, there is no issue on the table remotely as morally compelling as saving the Union, maybe, because that's what the war was fought over. And by the way, that's not at all to say that the South wasn't at all thinking about slavery when it seceded. These are two entirely different questions, by the way. The secession and the war. Yes, no doubt the southern states were thinking about slavery, at least some of them. Some of them were thinking about slavery when they seceded. But that's a very different question about why was the war fought.
Okay, last clip we'll play here from this one is history and comedy. I don't know if they're always a mix, but they maybe should be.
And then he says, and maybe, just maybe, the schools could start teaching history. The Ben Stein history is a comic book in which there are bad people in the states and good people running the federal government. And sometimes those bad people need to be hit with a hammer. And it's a good thing we handed those hammers to the people in the federal government because they're wise and wonderful. I guess if you're a Nixon and Ford speechwriter for a while, you'd start to believe stuff like that. But in fact, the schools, if they were to start teaching history, it would be to teach the opposite of what Ben Stein wants taught. What Ben Stein is talking about is being taught everywhere. Everybody believes what he believes about secession and slavery, but particularly about secession. It's stupid. Well, I will give him credit. At least he admits that the Constitution doesn't forbid it. So, I mean, that's better than most schools. But we really should have schools that teach real history. And incidentally, I might point out to you, by the way, that starting today, we're actually running a bit of a...
Okay, and Tom goes into one of his own history clubs, classroom things. Okay, that was episode 796. Secession is for morons, says Ben Stein. But a lot of things have changed since then, and you know, the world's gone crazy. I don't know if you'd still say this, but it's always interesting to see who's saying what. Now he's saying that there's a GOP person from talking about from the liberal California. He lived in California, so maybe didn't want that. Anyway, things changed from there. Okay, let's go to episode 812. We're cruising here to the end. This is the truth about Chile's Augusto Pinochet with Axel Kaiser. I thought this was interesting because we love Hapa. There's the meme about him in basically community removal, helicopter rides. Let's start with this one is mixed feelings on Pinochet. By the way, I wasn't
was that even to this day,
interview.
People in Chile are very divided regarding their views of Pinochet and his legacy. Is that a correct impression on my part?
That's a correct impression, Tom. And you know, we were on the verge of a civil war in 1973 when Pinochet took over power, you know, and Allende killed himself. Some people think that he was killed by the Chilean military. Actually, he shot himself with an AK-47 that was given to him by Fidel Castro himself when he came to Chile after Allende had been elected. So we were on this Cold War logic, and in the end, the anti-communist forces and anti-totalitarian forces prevailed, which does not justify what happened later. But the country is still divided. You have to keep in mind that Pinochet, after 17 years in government, he had this referendum, yes or no referendum, where he reintroduced democracy. But the question was if he stayed as president with an elected parliament and everything, or he had to go home. He lost, but with 44% of the votes. We don't have to forget that. So he was very popular among the Chilean population, and this is a fact, even today.
All right.
Okay, so some mixed feelings on Pinochet. Not a big fan myself, but interesting guy. Threw communists out of helicopters. Tom does get into that. Was he doing his best for the people? Allende, Pinochet.
Were always and everywhere terribly exploited. How can you show that that's not correct?
Well, you have to look at the numbers. We had 1,000% inflation, year adjusted inflation in 1973. We had scarcity of all basic goods, you name it, you know, from rice to bread to anything you want, meat, whatever, milk. We didn't have these things. We had government was completely bankrupted by these policies of printing money and spending money and all this. You know, industries were confiscated and they were not working. I don't know any Chilean left-wing economist, serious left-wing economist, who would agree with the statement that Allende had a reasonable economic management of the country. No one in Chile, not even left-wing economists, maybe some Marxist economists, even today defend Allende, but not the left-wing serious economists, defend the economic management of the Allende regime. They all have read papers, books, and they all admit that the economic management, the socialist central planned economy that he tried to introduce in Chile was a disaster.
Okay, so which is interesting if you look at the history of that. So Allende was the socialist, then Pinochet comes in. He's kind of a right-wing dictator. Dictators are all bad. It just depends on which one you are, so get thrown out. Okay, let's keep going on this one. Subject to dictatorship on some of these countries. What's up with that?
Then we have so Chilean people don't like this. They don't tolerate this mismanagement, this chaos, basically. And that's why even today, Tom, even today, you go to take a look at the surveys. The most respected institutions among Chilean people are the armed forces and police. It's incredible. After everything what happened. And this is a puzzle to many people, but it's because Chileans don't like this kind of chaotic situations. And then they resort to a strong person or a guy who can bring back order. And I have to repeat, Pinochet, he obtained 44% of the votes after 17 years of dictatorship.
So we got 44%. Then he took over, and they were somewhat okay with that. Okay, keep going along here. I'm trying to push through here. Who was Pinochet?
Is Pinochet? 1973 rolls around. Who is this man? Had anybody ever heard of him?
He was really not very well known. He was not very important figure within the military. He had not been a great student. He had not been someone who would call your attention because he was very vocal in any respect. He had no known ideology. This is incredible. No one knew if he was left wing. As I said, Allende himself appointed him a commander in chief of the army, basically, and so he was no one special, so to speak. When he had to act, he even hesitated, because the guys who really wanted the coup and who really pushed for the coup after what happened with the deputies chamber were the guys from the Navy, Merino, and Pinochet was the last one to say, okay, I'm with you, and
I got the feeling of some of this where he's kind of a fan. I mean, this guy's a little more right wing. He understands the Mises Caucus. I mean, not the Mises Institute and all that. So it's fine. He's got a little libertarian stuff. He talks about Friedman and some of these others that came down there to help him with economics. So look, Pinochet was definitely better than Allende, especially if you have a little bit of a right wing bent to you. But he's still kind of a piece of trash. 23. Let me see. This one is helicopter rides. Let's go into that.
Had several people, libertarians, say to me, whatever good you can say about Pinochet is clearly overwhelmed by the human rights abuses, because it doesn't matter how much he freed markets. If a single person died, it can't be justified. And that's where they leave it. What do you think about that?
I think that's a nonsensical argument. I don't know. I mean, would they rather have a dictator that, besides from human rights abuses, leaves a disaster, an economic disaster as a legacy? Like would they go for Castro rather than Pinochet? Because Castro, we all know that Cuba is a disaster economically. That people are have no access to basic goods and all this, and we all know that the healthcare system is a myth, and all these things are basic lies that you see replicated in the New York Times everywhere. But we all know this is not true. And when he dies, everyone speaks about the great Fidel, and even Obama didn't dare to say something against him. But when you go to Pinochet, who, of course, they were many cases, but let's put the things in perspective. According to the official records of the Chilean democratic government, under Pinochet, 3,000, a little more than 3,000, something more than 3,000 people were killed. 3,000, most of them between 1973 and 1975. The justification for this was fighting against terrorism, Marxism, and all this. Okay. And this is, of course, terrible. It happened. But when it comes to Fidel Castro, according to Project Cuba, it's about 100,000 people, human rights abuses. And
once again, I'm like, you're trying to say that your country, and I understand this guy may have a little bit of a bias here because he's from Chile, probably. But when you're trying to compare your human rights abuses of your president, putting people, literally dropping them alive out in the middle of the ocean from a helicopter, which is horrible. They're communists. I get it. They're bad. Do it as you will. But to justify that because Castro killed people, completely different country, completely different situation. This seems a little shitty. So look, how about try not to be, let's just bring me in here to make sure. How about try not to be a shithole country? There you go. That's my take on that one. Last one, but Tom's like, what about these human rights abuses though? I mentioned them before. I tried to get it to you nicely. What about them?
What are we talking about exactly?
Well, they were, of course, people that were tortured. They were missing people. So they sometimes the security police would come, take people away, and then you would never find out if they killed them, what they did with them. And some of them were actually killed and then thrown into the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. I'm not saying all of them were innocent in the sense that they were not engaging in revolutionary activities or terrorist activities, but I'm sure some of them were innocent. And so the Rettig report is called the official document where these casualties were registered, and they did the whole work of trying to determine how they were killed and how many people died. And this was done in the 90s. So when we had democracy. So the Rettig report shows about
when we had a democracy. I'm sorry. I just really want to laugh about that. I understand left and right, whatever. I remember when I was a few years ago, early 2000s or maybe, Pinochet was on the run, I want to say, and I think he went to France. This is all just coming out of my memory, or Spain, and then there was some extradition where they get him for war crimes or human rights abuses. I don't know. He's kind of a piece of shit, and I hate that libertarians try to defend him simply because he pushed communists out the airport helicopter. Fine, or that Milton Friedman went down there to help him. Fine. He was better on economics and whatever. I still think old man piece of shit because South American countries, whatnot. Okay. Episode 812, The Truth About Chile's Augusto Pinochet. That was that one we just did. This one is, and we've got just what, 2 or 3 more, 4 more? Jesus. We're Tom Woods month, I think is what we're going to do. Do men really have all the power? Paul Elam on the men's right movement, a men's movement. I could do a whole hour of this one myself as a family law attorney. And I just want to say real quick before we get into this one, Paul Elam is fine. I saw the Cassie J Red Pill documentary. I enjoyed that as well. He was kind of featured on there. It's what changed her from being a feminist to kind of sympathizing with men's rights. That documentary is very good. My problem, I do family law. I deal with this stuff all the time. There's some misnomers about court and about men. Men don't prepare well. Then they want to use men. Courts are against us. And then when they do that, they become the victims. And then they allow the court system to, in a sense, give them an excuse for being a shitty client. I have great clients. I have bad clients. I could go over and over, and I've done this with stories of them just making mistakes. And I've done a Substack about some of this stuff, Libertarian, the Wild Wild West of family courts. Check it out. It's tylerjanke.substack.com. And I've got some stuff written on there about it. I've been doing podcasts about this. Once again, men shouldn't be victims. They can't act like victims. They have to do some things. They have to prepare for litigation. They have to understand there's courts of equity. There's courts of law. There is ways that they need to understand the outcomes, the possibilities. And yes, sometimes mothers are favored in certain circumstances, but if you do the right thing, you're not going to have a problem. And if you stop making mistakes, you've got to prepare. If the courts are against you and they're stacked against you, then you can't afford to make mistakes. And some of the men's rights movement gives them that reason to say, hey, it's not my fault. Then do something about it. These are your kids. It's very important. Okay, we've been through this with this Greg Ellis guy and the respondent. He's kind of a piece of shit, and he gives a bad name to some of these things. So let's do some of these. Once again, this is Paul Elam, and just one here. Pinochet. Oh, I still had one left of. Let's get rid of the Pinochet one. Boom. Okay, there we go. Let's do this one. This next one, Paul Elam. I actually like this guy. I think he's got a lot of good things today. He doesn't bring these things up as victims. Hat tip to the Red Pill, Casey J, men's right movement. What is it?
Is a little bit convoluted in this culture right now.
This one's about power.
Any man that's ever been in a family court trying to get access to his children from a hostile ex would have a very different picture of what power is than somebody who hasn't been through that.
I do want to get to that in a minute, but let's imagine a devil's advocate scenario in which somebody comes at you with, let's look at men as a percentage of CEOs, or let's look at men's income, or men in positions of leadership, whether political or otherwise. And it's overwhelmingly tipped toward men. So how is it that you can say that men are not, in fact, really running the show?
Okay, good. That's a really good point to bring up. If we want to look at it through an occupational lens, through position and power, we look at politics, we look at CEOs for Fortune 1000 companies, which I think right now are less than 5% women. If we're going to look at it through that lens, shouldn't we also, or rather looking at it through what's called the glass ceiling, shouldn't we also look at it through the glass cellar? The vast preponderance of people in very dangerous professions, very brutal work, harsh and dangerous, are also men. Are the people who crawl down into our sewers are almost all men. The people that get on our crab boats and fishing boats in order to provide for their families are almost all men. The people that die in our wars are almost all men. So it seems a little disingenuous to me that if we're going to point at professions and say, okay, these are dominated by men, that we not also take a look across the board at all professions and realize that the most powerless ones in our culture are also dominated by men.
And by the way, my buddy Andy, who's gone through some of this stuff and he's really smart along this, he brought this up about how men when we did our breakdown of Hannah Cox's feminism's take on men's rights, which is just trash from start to finish. Andy and I hit it out of the park on our analysis. Now, sometimes, like I mentioned in there, we're almost hypocritical because I dislike some of the stuff she says so much. I feel like I have to push back. But I encourage you to go find this on our Substack and to watch it or become a member on our Odyssey or Spotify page, because I think as a family law attorney and two dads, we don't want ever men to be the victim, and that just does not serve you well. It doesn't serve your kids well, especially from a libertarian point of view. Okay, we'll keep going on here. 629 in family courts. Take it away, Paul.
Say that this is all anecdotal. You're dealing with particularly outrageous cases. But surely there's some way to aggregate the numbers and reach some kind of conclusion about what these courts are like, I would think.
Well, we know that in 84% of contested custody cases that men lose. That seems like a pretty lopsided statistic.
Now, I work in California. I don't see that at all. That's maybe a stat from nationwide, which you get a broad swath of different statistics that come into this. Blue states, red states, they're a little bit different. The ones that are heavily liberal, they tend to want to equalize things out. So then they tend to say, oh, it's equal. Like California, it's actually much better for men here. So if you're a man in California and you're making mistakes and it's a problem, or you're not getting the right custody, it might be one, you've put your dick in crazy and it's a new child and you're splitting early on this relationship. Let's say you're a father and you've had kids for 5 years or so, you're likely going to get 50-50. It's just going to happen unless you're a piece of shit. Or she's a liar and she puts forth, like fake rape claims, which I can't believe. I'm doing family law. I'm having parties that are married for 20 years and a party is claiming that they were raped on their first date. I literally had that. It's insane. So women will say crazy shit. The point is, though, you can push back, and with litigation and doing the right thing, you can push back on these things and get the right stuff. I don't know if that's his claim, but I imagine this 80% or the stat that he's saying here is nationwide.
To me, we know from the tender years doctrine, which came along as a response to patriarchy way back, late 1800s, early 1900s, that the default setting for family courts was to assume that mothers were more fit custodians of their children. That is an
sorry to push back on this a little bit. You got to admit, child 0 to like 3 years old, mother, there's a bond there, there's breastfeeding involved. If you don't take that into account, you are somewhat crazy. And I understand there's crazy women. Once again, don't put your dick in crazy. So you've got to take these things into account. That should be separated. Let's take an account of a 14-year-old. You've been involved and you've been married for 20 years. Now you're getting divorced. Your kids are 14 years old, 12 years old, maybe 9 years old. Dad should have that initial. Why not give them the chance? They've been taking care of this child for years. They should be able to do it. Let's keep going.
Institutional bias that is right there under our nose. We see it all the time. We see it in the results of custody disputes. We see it in the numbers of men who are incarcerated for being unable to afford alimony or child support. I don't think it's anecdotal. What's anecdotal is the numbers of men who commit suicide, the ones who end up living on the street, living in their cars, having to live with relatives in order to meet their child support payments. Those I would look at as anecdotal points, the worst end scenario of the family court system. But overall, men, I was told when I divorced that you might as well bring your wallet in there, and forgive my directness, but this is what my attorney said. He said, you have a penis, you're at a disadvantage.
Okay, could be true. By the way, if we're going to go around the route of being a Chad, you're going to have your wife stay home, then you're going to suffer the consequences when you get a divorce. And when you do so, your wife hasn't had a job, you're going to be paying up. Sorry, I don't know what to tell you. Or we can go down the feminism route where you're having a dual income family, your wife's working, and you're not going to be paying because you're equalized out. There's parity involved. There's problems we have both sides. So pick and choose. What are you going to do? Okay. No fault divorce. What do you think about this? I'm not a big fan myself, but keep going.
What kind of reforms are you advocating? Anything specific? What do you want to see happen?
I'd like to see an end to no fault divorce for one.
All right, let's stop right there. Elaborate on it. Tell us exactly what that. I mean, most people know what that is, but just in case, exactly what that is and what the problem with it is.
Well, the first state back in the 1960s, Ronald Reagan, governor of California, signed no-fault divorce into law, and it basically establishes that you can get out of a marriage without reason, without cause, at any point, and without consequence. That you can, and marriage being a contract, you can basically violate your end of the contract with no reason whatsoever, with no proof of breach on the other side. And you can take the house, and you can take the children, and you can have the man's income taken for child support and for alimony. Consequently, the divorce rate skyrocketed after that. And the thinking behind it was that there were a lot of women trapped in abusive marriages that couldn't prove that they were in an abusive marriage. And this was the way to get them out of that marriage, that they didn't have to prove that there was abuse going on. And there is, I suppose, some rationale for that, because there are some marriages that are abusive. But what it still established was a guideline that gave a woman in particular financial incentive once the average divorce happens at about 7 years. That also happens to be once the first child enters school and when the man starts reaching toward his peak in income. And that provides a financial incentive for women to take the physical property that has been gathered in the marriage and the man's income and custody of the children, and to cut him out of the family altogether, consequently hurting the children. And that's what we have, is a rampant divorce rate that is tearing our families apart. And I just think that we would be a lot better off if there needed to be cause in a marriage to dissolve it without consequence to the person filing.
Okay, so first of all, I would just say not totally agree with that. The reasons being is it's way too easy for the women think about litigation much more than men. That's my experience as a family law attorney for decades here, that they come into it with a plan. They're home, maybe more. They've got the schedule taken care of. They've thought about this. The dude's just out working, and suddenly shit's hitting the fan. Maybe he's cheating on her, whatever. That's the problem. So the woman is going to be much more accountable. How do you account for crazy? What if you've made that mistake? She's fine. Maybe she didn't tell you that she's bipolar. Have this way too much. Now she's crazy, and you need to get out of this deal, this contract. You can't account for that in any way. So maybe there should be a default of 50-50. I get that for children, but I don't necessarily agree with this, because the woman's going to prepare for this. She's going to have all this stuff. She's going to blame you for all kinds of stuff, even crazy. I'm not a fan of the no-fault divorce. It would make my job completely insane at this point. Last one we'll do here is the Violence Against Women Act. Totally agree with Paul Elam on this one. Let's go here and play
the Violence Against Women Act. We hear an awful lot about this, and again, it's like with a lot of legislation. It has such a benign name. Is there anybody in favor of violence against women that it?
Oops. Hang on here. For some reason, I just stopped it here. Let's get this back in and go, Tom.
It's like the Patriot Act. Who could stand against that?
Right.
And certainly no one, not me, nobody I know, is in support of violence against women. That doesn't mean the Violence Against Women Act is even has any efficacy toward that end. I mean, there's big questions about that, whether or not it does. But what it is essentially a gendered law in a society that is supposed to be about equal treatment under the law. It only recognizes female victims and male perpetrators, despite the fact that all the valid evidence that we have in, and I mean from CDC to Harvard, Martin Fibert did an annotated bibliography of over 400 studies with a sampling of 371,000 people in surveys that establishes that intimate partner violence has what we call gender symmetry. It's roughly equal between men and women. And we end up, as people might have seen in the Red Pill movie, 2,000 federally funded shelters for women in the United States. Again, that's not a problem. I don't think we should necessarily consider the federal government a solution to all social problems, but certainly I don't have issue with shelters being funded for victims of domestic violence. But none of these shelters service men. They turn them away.
Okay. Yeah. So men are, look, I'm not denying that at all. Part of the problem you have there, though, is I just don't want to see anything to do with the federal government kind of like coming into this at all. So helping them out. I thought it would be interesting real quickly, because we did this, I don't want to say hate watch, but false allegations here by Hannah Cox. Let's,
have
play this
virtually
real
no
quick.
incentive to
Oh,
lie or
bitch.
falsely report, and just about every reason to stay mum. In fact, some studies show as many as 60% of sexual assaults are not reported. When it comes
Okay, I probably shouldn't get to play me talking about her, doing about false allegations. But what she said there is false allegations. And then the point of the whole thing I'd make is, how do you know they're, well, or are allegations not made too? That was another one. 60% weren't even made. How do you know they weren't actually made? They were, you don't know. The false allegations one though is also pretty, crap, but check that out. We do a great breakdown. I'm going to skip episode 832, which is do men, that's the one we just talked about. Do men really have all the power? That's Paul Elam, men's movement. The next one was 848. I shouldn't write off the left altogether. This is a great conversation with Tom Woods and Dave Smith talking about the left and how you shouldn't necessarily write them off. You should have this conversation with them. This was obviously before the Reno reset. It was obviously before COVID. I'm going to skip this one, but go check that out. It's episode 848. I think there's maybe some things that I would totally disagree with at this point, now, but we're going to go into CATO VP attacks Ron Paul story. I share stories I have kept secret. This is what's his name? What's the guy's name here we're talking about here? Tom Woods. We'll start off with this one. This one starts out with in defense of libertarian infighting. So here we go.
I want to defend libertarian infighting for a minute, if I may.
Sure.
If somebody is mixing up the message and sending the wrong message to people, why would you not want to correct that? Why would you say, well, to each his own, everybody has his own definition of libertarianism? No, that's not true. What are you talking about? Well, we can't have that. That's not to say we can't have some open questions among ourselves that haven't been completely resolved. Well, that's one thing. But I'm talking about questions that are more or less resolved, where there's a libertarian who's giving a confusing answer or the flat-out wrong answer. What would be wrong with correcting that person? It doesn't mean that's all you do, right? It just means that once in a while you feel you have to do it. Now, in my case, it's true I do go after other libertarians once in a while, but really not that much. I mean, honestly, you look through my corpus of articles, I mean, how many of them are really criticizing other libertarians? They're usually criticizing critics of libertarianism, which I do as a teaching opportunity. There'll be some article on Salon and everybody sharing it.
Okay, so there you go. Tom gives his defense for why you should be able to bitch and moan about libertarian infighting. And by the way, I'm totally in agreement. I did a whole podcast on this neoliberalism, which was Andy Craig, Joe Bishop Henchman after Reno, going on there just trashing Tom Woods, mostly Dave Smith, I guess, Michael Heiss, and it's libertarian infighting. And I did a complete episode of that. I think I did a great job of dispelling any reason why you should listen to any of those people who have never really had a real job. That's okay. So background of this beefing. Let's go.
Now, there's a long-standing rivalry dispute that goes back a long time between the Cato Institute and a lot of other libertarians, and in particular between the Cato Institute and the Mises Institute. Now, I'm not going to get into all that. I'm not even really qualified to get into all that, all the historical details of that. But I will say that I saw this firsthand myself. Now, again, basically my view is there are some decent people at the Cato Institute doing some decent work, and I've read a lot of their stuff and benefited from it. I've cited some of their stuff in my writing. I've recommended some of their stuff here on the show, which is more than you can say about what they've done for me, right? I mean, they act as if I don't even exist. So I feel like I've been the adult in the room in this situation. But all the same, in 2006, I won a book prize for my book, The Church and the Market. And it was a prize that was co-sponsored by the Templeton Foundation and the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. And there were 3 places, first, second, and third for books, and first, second, and third for articles. So I won first place in the book category. And I remember Ed Stringham, and I think a co-author, might have been Ben Powell, actually. I can't remember who his co-author was, or maybe he wrote it himself, and I'm not giving him proper credit. Anyway, one of the winners in the article category was Ed Stringham, who, as you know, if you've listened a long time, has been on this show. Well, apparently, in advance, the Cato Institute had agreed to host whoever the winners were at a one-day conference at the Cato Institute. Well, they obviously had no idea I was going to win. Senior fellow of the Mises Institute, they had no idea I was going to win. Their people had been smearing me for years. Tom Palmer, for example. This is a guy, let me pause for a minute. Tom Palmer's a guy I got to know when I was a student at Harvard.
Okay, Tom goes into the beefing. There's a whole backbone or backstory of it. Part of that has to do with the fact Rothbard, way back in the day, he gives you an understanding. Anyway, we'll keep going here. This is what's the attack about, Tom? Come on.
Anyway, Brink Lindsay attacks Ron Paul on Twitter. I mean, this already sounds like something out of high school, doesn't it? But of course, they didn't have Twitter when I was in high school. And he says Ron Paul's xenophobia, Ron Paul, xenophobic, right, was a hideous corruption of libertarian ideas. Now, this is being uttered, by the way, by a guy who supported, well, he supported quite a few recent wars, including the most idiotic war in American history, the Iraq War. And by the way, I do allow, I'm a very open-minded person, I allow for debate on what was the most idiotic war in American history. My vote is the Iraq War, but I'm willing to entertain other possibilities there. He supported that, but Ron Paul's the xenophobe. So Lindsay wants to bomb people on propaganda grounds that wouldn't have satisfied a second grader. So he's okay with all these foreigners dying, but the xenophobe is the guy who doesn't want the foreigners to die. If you can keep up with the Cato Institute lexicon on stuff like this, then you're better than I am. So totally detached from reality. Now, Lindsay himself is somebody who has favored, he absolutely hates the fact that libertarians and conservatives have ever worked together. That's terrible. Now, you all know I have not a whole lot of patience for the neocons, and I've been very critical of them and of a lot of conservatives here on the show, to the point where a lot of people said, why don't you ever criticize Barack Obama? All you ever do is criticize the right. So, I don't need to be lectured to about the problems with the right. But I do know that I make a heck of a lot more converts on the right than I do on the left, and that's something I pointed out on the show quite a few times. Well, Lindsay favors something, a view that he calls libertarian, because the left shares some of our views, so maybe they'll want to hook up with us. Well, you can check your local listings to see if there is a Brink Lindsay show on MSNBC, but I'm afraid you will be disappointed. So that's how that has worked. All right, so I personally think it's a bit rich for Lindsay, of all people, to call anybody a xenophobe after all the foreigners whose lives he favored snuffing out. No, I didn't. This is all collateral damage. Yeah, you had to know that was going to happen. You had to know that chaos was going to result. You had to know that millions of people are going to be displaced from their homes. And if you didn't know that, then you're a moron who's not entitled to an opinion in the first place.
Okay. Tom does a great job of just kind of blasting through this. We're done with that one. And I thought one last thing I would say is I did this thing, like I mentioned here, called the clubbing Mises with Planck 3.5. This is, but I played a clip here. This is me watching myself play a clip of the fifth column talking about Ilya Shapiro and how he was treated with Cato.
The main negative surprise was that the Cato Institute, where I spent almost 15 years, was completely silent.
Oh.
You would think that an institution devoted to free speech and academic freedom and integrity would have done something about that, let alone any conceptions of loyalty to me.
Why do you think that was?
That'll have to be the subject for a different podcast.
Okay. But it sounds like it didn't surprise you.
Let's just say it didn't surprise me as much as it would have 5 years ago.
Sure.
There are certain tendencies at Cato, both managerial and ideological, that have been going in directions that I think are not good, not just with respect to me, but in terms of promoting Cato's own value.
Okay, I play that as part of that whole breakdown where the Cato guys and there's I know Tom Woods, Scott Horton like to say, oh, they're foreign policy, whatever. Ilya, not Shapiro, but Ilya, I'm trying to remember the other guy's name. I have him in my open where he's like the libertarian case for vaccines. Go fuck yourself. This last one we're going to do here is episode 914. I gallop through Soviet history. I thought this one was particularly interesting because I don't know that it takes a contrary view, but it takes a different view of kind of Michael Malice's white pill, or maybe it's a tag along of his book about Soviet history. But this is from a guy who grew up in Soviet Union, maybe next like that Axel Kaiser, who was down in Chile. So he maybe is a little biased on this, but here we go. What is this first one out? Good Lenin, bad Stalin.
Sympathizing circles. It's the good Lenin, bad Stalin myth. In fact, my own professor of Russian history, Vladimir Brovkin, said that this drove him crazy, that there were people who believed that Lenin was basically a good guy, and then Stalin came along and corrupted everything. How would you respond to that?
Oh, well, I'm doing actually, my new episodes are on the Russian Revolution, which is all about Lenin, and I started to look at Lenin since his very birth, and I looked at his family history and everything. And Lenin, well, I don't know, Lenin started the massive terror. He was one of the institutors of war communism. He ordered, he personally wrote orders so that hundreds and thousands of kulaks would be hanged in public, or so that everyone would be afraid and would just collaborate. Lenin was just as bloodthirsty as Stalin. It's just that they had other political conflicts late in Lenin's life. But yeah, Lenin was just as ruthless murderer as Stalin was. There are no good Lenin, bad Stalin thing going on here. And Trotsky also was just as evil as these two. So it was kind of weird. But during
Okay, so there you go. All bad. That's perfectly good. Next one we're going to go through here on the Gallop Through Soviet History, episode 914, was Ukrainian terror and starvation fake? Tom Woods, how dare you say such a thing? But here we go.
I actually argued about this on the internet a few days ago because some listeners just look at my logo and decide that I'm very pro-communist, and then they add me to various Facebook groups, and I got added to this Facebook group where there were people with exactly this argument. And when you look at the pictures, when you look at all the documentation, it is ridiculous because see, Ukraine is one of the more fertile. It's one of the more fertile places on the planet, and that's where like most of the grain was grown also in the Russian Empire. So what Stalin did was he needed money for industrialization, and he had also spent like a huge gold reserves on it already. So what he did was that he chose this region where most grain was produced and just confiscated it all and sold it off to Americans. No, seriously, your country were the most like the top buyers of this grain from Stalin.
Okay, well, it's good to know that we're participating in the starvation there. Okay, next one here, Soviet archives. This one rang really true to me because I've been a big fan of like the Dark Woods, the Black Book of Communism. There's multiple books about Soviet spies, and when the Cold War happened and the wall fell down, the Kremlin opened up a lot of Soviet spy information to the West, and there's publishers that paid millions of dollars to have access to this. But the way they had to do it was they had an author, and that author would then work with a Soviet agent who they would go in and read all the documents and then give it back. So there was some really good things. We had Alger Hiss as a spy, all these other things you could document about the spying, you know, McCarthy had mentioned, not totally right, but a lot of this. So there's a lot of verification coming from this. This gentleman says
different opinions on what we found there, because some people say we opened the archives and it turns out the crimes were even more scarlet than we realized, and others say we opened the archives and it turns out we had exaggerated the extent of the crimes. What did the opening of the archives really tell us?
You mean the archives in Moscow?
Yes.
Well, the archives in Moscow told exactly what the people opening them wanted them to say, because the biggest problem with studying Soviet era history in general is that a lot of the documents written in the Soviet era by Soviet authors, Soviet historians, like, you know, everyday newspapers, everyday documents written by clerks, they contain falsehoods themselves. Okay, so that's the issue. The government blatantly used misinformation, and a lot of this stuff is very unreliable. And for me, that's the biggest difficulty when I do my Eastern Border show, that I have to triple check everything. I have to rely not only on these sources, but on the opinions of these sources, because, well, for example, Russia these days has tendency to only, all the archives even haven't been opened yet, for starters. So the parts that have been opened are obviously thought by Russian experts today, you know, as being okay to open. So there's still stuff that we don't know about.
Right. And so, by the way, there were multiple authors, multiple access archives, you know, or accessed by these different ones. And what was interesting is there would be, they were able to say there's all different type of agencies in Russia as well, NKVD, whatever the different Soviet KGB thing at the time. And they had different names for different people, but they were able to correlate these up. So I think a lot of the information we got was legit and good. This guy obviously seems to be a little bit more skeptical. Perfectly fine. Last one was, hey, that's that Cold War. How did it end?
They had been playing major roles in them.
Well, now to complete our incredibly rapid gallop through Soviet history, let's talk about one of the most interesting topics of all, which is how it all came to an end. What do you think the contributing factors were?
Genes and rock and roll, man.
Genes and rock and roll.
So it was that.
It was exactly that, and I've got a bunch of episodes on this because this is how the show started. But you see, my dad, he used to play bass in the opera orchestra for 20 years. But you know, as a young student, he wanted to get an electric guitar, and he had to build one on his own because you couldn't get them there. But so you know, there was always a huge black market for everything. And like your average salary for an engineer was 120 rubles per month. That was kind of a higher up salary, you know, middle class salary, so to speak. A pair of jeans smuggled in from the US cost about 200 rubles, which is over a monthly salary, obviously. And like everyone was making the craziest illegal stuff ever. I mean, and especially when it came to music, because not only illegal tapes were just circulating around. No, at one point, this was a bit early. This was already, I think, in the 70s. There was something called rentgenizdat, which is like when people dug through the garbage bins of hospitals, looking for old Röntgen images random images just thrown out, used X-ray scans. And then they as they were mobile, they used to imprint vinyls on them. And these were called bones. The Soviet man was ingenious in the way how he basically smuggled in everything, and we really, really appreciated all the crazy stuff that we saw, because it became really apparent that you guys over there lived way better than we did.
Yeah, I mean that's the kind of the way to break down these kind of things. North Korea, same idea. If you can break through and show that. Malice talks about this in his newest book. He talks about Gorbachev. I think it was coming to the U.S., touring something, going to a little grocery store and realizing that everything is, just the normal people have everything, and saying they've lied to us. So you've got to keep it down. Okay. Last one we'll do here is Gorbachev. Was he really this great person? Malice and Horton seem to think so. How about our author here? Who is it?
What was the opinion of Gorbachev among the general public?
See, even though he's gotten the Peace Prize, he's also one of the people who tried to institute prohibition in the Soviet Union.
I didn't know that. I don't know how I didn't know that. Was this a productivity measure?
Yeah, he was a really, truly idealistic communist. And he really looked back at Stalin's era and thought that, this was wrong, and but he essentially thought that communism could work and that people wanted the communism to work. He just thought the bureaucracy were just too selfish, and that corruption was not a product of the socialist government, that the production had come because of ineffective leadership and all that. Okay, so he honestly thought that by giving more liberties, he would kind of make people happier, and that he actually honestly thought that people wanted to live in the Soviet Union, which is crazy. He still committed a lot of crimes. I mean, he's the guy who ordered, remember Chernobyl catastrophe, right, in 1986?
Yeah,
okay?
Of course, yeah.
Gorbachev tried to really deny anything, and he really tried to keep everything in control and stop people from panicking. And he only admitted it to the West when someone from Sweden had contacted him and asked him, hey, what's going on? The radiation levels are getting higher. And what he did personally, and he ordered that, the communist children's mass demonstrations and mass parties would be held very near in the radiation zone next to Chernobyl, in the other kind of centers of the region. In the major towns, because he wanted to show in public to television that everything was okay, guys. And so he basically dragged like tens of thousands of school kids to massively radiated areas and forced them to just walk around and, in these childhood communist party celebration meetings too. And they did this, and they did it just a day after this happened. He just...
So basically, he's a piece of shit still. And I believe that. And I know Malice, Horton say, oh, he's a great, person to help bring down the Cold War or helped end it or whatnot. Sorry about this. I quite possibly, but in the same respect, you've got to understand that he's kind of a piece of shit, right? I think so. Okay, that's what we have for this Tom Woods episode. Next one we're doing is clips from day 3. Bob Murphy, more Brion McClanahan, more Rise and Fall, the progressive era. Where did rights come from? Libertarian drama, Jason Stapleton involved in that. James Damore, you might remember it. Stefan Molyneux, Owen Benjamin, Gareth Porter, Noam Chomsky, Lou Rockwell, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Michael Malice, Objective Truths, Matt Welch on libertarianism, and should libertarians support secession? Thanks, everybody. Libertarian Podcast Review, Tom Woods Week powers on. This was 2.5 hours. I can't believe we just did that. Take care.
Okay, I'm leaving now. Bye, guys.
But she's back.
And now.
Chick-fil-A is completely overrated. It's not that good. I prefer Zaxby's. I prefer Popeyes.
Takes a tough man to make a tender forecast, Nick. And I guess that's me. Keep fucking that chicken.
Should I vote for Dick Cheney on the Libertarian Party? Do I have an obligation to vote for Dick Cheney?
I would say so.
Yes.
Did it work for those people?
No, it never does. I mean, these people somehow delude themselves into thinking it might, but it might work for us.
That one dude was like, not a podcast. I can't find it anywhere. And they don't have video.
Oh, yeah, Peter Janke. Yeah.
Yeah, I blocked him.
I'll do it. If he unblocks me, I'll...
He'll buy your shirt if you unblock him, Bert.
He's a wigger.
Yeah, nothing cooler than a 49-year-old wigger.
I just started live streaming. Cut me some slack. I'm pretty high tech for a boomer. But anyways,
boomer.